Well, thanks so much for being here. And I know Brack is a longtime collaborator of JPAL's. And so I actually wanted to start, though, asking the question. So your title is Managing Director of the Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit more about who are the ultra poor, and in particular, kind of picking up on the themes you've been hearing about, how are they being affected by climate change?
Yeah, so I was listening carefully to Amy and James and Hindu, and I'm just going to draw the thread through, I think, to what our conversation is going to be about, which is that people are both the victims but also the source of the solutions. And I think you heard that in the presentations before. And what I'm going to talk about is no different than that. And that brings me to the question of the ultra poor. And frankly, the term is a bit of an accident. It was an internal term developed by Brack. Brack was founded at Bangladesh's independence just after, and about 25 years into Bangladesh's development, the mid-90s, many indicators were improving, poverty was coming down. But the data was starting to show that there were these pockets of households that were not benefiting either from Brack's programs, anyone else's programs, nor from the broader progress across Bangladesh. So we gave it it was an internal term. It was really a way of segmenting a particular group of people and giving them some programmatic focus within Brack. But as we've actually moved beyond Bangladesh, we see other countries that are making enormous progress, but have these large pockets of people still living in extreme poverty. So the World Bank, we don't use, the term ultra poor, you can call it what you want, but the World Bank calls it people living in extreme poverty. And we estimate there are at least 100 million households still in that category, more than 500 million people. So that's the background.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. And in your work and sort of what you know on the ground, how are their lives changing because of climate change?
Yeah, so it was difficult to imagine Bangladesh becoming almost middle income. It's almost hard to imagine what's going to happen next with climate change. But let me give a few facts and figures to start. One is that when we estimate there are about 2,000 people who show up in Dhaka every day, and we survey these people, and we correlate where they've come from. And it probably won't surprise anybody in the room that they come from the poorest districts, they come from flood-prone areas, and they come from areas where there's rising salinity in the soil, which is affecting both drinking water and agricultural practices. And the World Bank estimates that there will be 13 million such people by 2050, which is probably, my estimate at that point is about 1 in 15 people will actually be a climate migrant, internal climate migrant. And so that's the scale of the problem for a place like Bangladesh. By the way, that pattern is pretty evident in different contexts. Brack is now in 15 other countries. So that pattern of this double whammy for people in extreme poverty, they are hit first, their disproportionate impact on their lives and livelihoods. And the second is that they've got, as you were saying at the beginning, they've got a thinner reserve of both social and financial and economic assets with which to withstand those. But as we're seeing here, we also think that they've got latent potential to actually be a big part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you described that part of the reason for kind of giving this label to a particular population was that their poverty was particularly sticky in the sense that even when economic growth was happening, they remained poor. And so this idea of ultra poor graduation, what is that? How does that work?
Well, I think, frankly, we observed it just from, being on the ground in Bangladesh, but I think that the academic literature has come to define sort of this broadly, this poverty trap, that if you don't do enough that is sufficient to get up and out, in fact, the incremental temporary progress is that you fall back right into the same category. So the graduation approach was something that we sort of determined that we needed to develop. We didn't call it graduation, by the way. That was given to it as it's moved globally. We just called it targeting the ultra poor originally. It was an internal term. It wasn't a marketing term or a fundraising term. It was really a programmatic term. It's a 2-year investment that is got a science to it. I won't go into the science here. But what happens is that once people get into the program, there is a new livelihood that they develop, and they develop the confidence actually to succeed at that livelihood. And so what we see, and this is where I think really the synergies with JPAL, IPA, and others has been really been powerful for us at BRAC, which is that the results really, and JPAL has the evidence in West Bengal 10 years on, you're still seeing a marked difference between people who graduated the program almost 10 years ago and those that have not had the benefit of being in the program yet. And there are some subtle important things, I think, in that for climate change, which is when you look closely at the data in West Bengal, those households not only get the enterprise during the graduation investment period, in the years that follow, even after they're gone, JPAL's found those households are better able to seize new opportunities, ones that might not have even been imagined at the time that they were in the graduation approach. So to me, that's the definition of adaptation resilience. And so there's something in there that we think is quite important for both poverty and climate adaptation.
Yeah, no, and I think this idea that part of what climate adaptation is resilience. It's the ability to respond to a situation that maybe hasn't been part of past experience. It sounds like that is something that you're seeing there. Can you elaborate that a little bit more? Sort of what looks like adaptation in the work that you do?
Well, I mean, I think it speaks to the, if you go visit a household, I think JPAL's found this in West Bengal. We've seen it in Bangladesh, of course. So when you go visit people, we have cohorts now. I think the first cohort graduated around 2007. When you see those households now, you ask them, what happened to you during COVID? They're like, nothing, it was fine. We managed, right? They've got, 2 or 3 businesses, kids in school, they own land, they were landless before. So they've got a range, you had mentioned before, this building up of both a financial asset or an economic asset, but also this sense of self-confidence that I can handle my problems and I've got the resources, but also there's something psychological that happens in that process. It's not simply handing something. Mm-hmm. There's actually a process. They've learned to be successful and take new risks and opportunities. Mm-hmm. So there's something in there, although one of the questions I had back for JPAL you were going to ask me about is what is the definition of resilience and adaptation? I think one of the research agendas is to perhaps define that a little bit more and figure out how we measure that. I think there's something in the graduation work that's there, but I think there's probably more in the research agenda for that.
Mm-hmm. I imagine if we asked people in the room to define adaptation, we would hear a number of different responses. What is your definition of adaptation?
Well, I go back to the fundamentals for BRAC, right? It's about putting households in a position to succeed themselves. That's been fundamental since our inception. So it's not about us solving their problems for them. Our job is to create the conditions and make the investments so that they are the best able to solve. So to me, that would be the definition of resilience and adaptation. Frankly, when we're no longer needed as much as we were before, mm-hmm. That would be a good story to tell.
Yeah. And so you've referred a couple of times to this collaboration with JPAL to evaluate the ultra-poor program. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of that process? And then I guess what I would be particularly interested to hear about is where you see evidence gaps emerging as sort of climate creeps into your work.
Yeah, so let me take that in 2 parts. So frankly, JPAL's work has changed BRAC fundamentally, and let me explain a little bit the story. As we developed the graduation program in the early 2000s, I think our own internal research was showing a promising story, and we were very happy to grow it within Bangladesh. But JPAL, IPA, and others said, let's test this in 6, initially it was only 6 other quite different environments, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of Asia. And we said, great, and we were very happy that it went beyond BRAC. Frankly, I don't know if BRAC really expected the results that came back in 2015, which were, I think this is, from that evidence, got to be one of the most promising, development interventions based on that body of evidence developed in 2015, which is since. Now that changed us, frankly. So what that meant in 2016, BRAC took $9 million of its own unrestricted funding to start the initiative that I now lead globally, which is to help governments scale this approach. So we felt the evidence. It's not always there in all the programs we run, but we felt in this case it was actually worth our time, our money, to get behind doing that. And so the program that I run is now outside Bangladesh. It's run by BRAC International. And we're trying to work with governments to scale this I mentioned the 100 million figure. Our goal at BRAC, with the movement that JPAL and others are a part of, is to get to 5%, or 5 million households, which is more than 20 million people. And if we can get there, I think the scale question would be largely solved, and we'd have momentum to get to hopefully a larger portion of the remaining 100 million. So that's our next goal as BRAC, and I think it's one shared with JPAL and others. Let me just quickly say JPAL's work in West Bengal went on, and this is where I think the magic of JPAL is evidence and action. And so I've mentioned the evidence in West Bengal, but JPAL, Co-Impact, Bundan, the partner from West Bengal, went to Bihar, large, very poor state, neighboring state in India, and they, in 2018, started to set up a graduation program with the government of Bihar. The acronym is SJY, and it is the largest high-fidelity graduation program in the world today. It's actually surpassed BRAC's in size. It's already put in 200,000 households in. Now, some cohorts are starting to graduate. So this, for us, is a beacon of an example of governments actually putting their own money on the line to invest in a high evidence-backed program. So later this month, my colleague Heidi is bringing 15 delegates from Indonesia to look at the program in Bihar. Okay, we've got delegates coming from different parts of Africa to look at. So I just want to really congratulate JPAL on making this, and it's just to say it's really changed our work and the potential for graduation.
And then where do you see some of the evidence gaps in your work kind of related to the climate adaptation challenge?
Yeah, so there are two pieces, perhaps. One is really scaling the evidence we already have, and again, that's the agenda that I'm most, and my colleagues are most focused on at BRAC. I think there are pieces of that. What is the science of scaling? How do you get scale? Because you don't always get scale with high fidelity. If we get scale with low fidelity programming, we're not going to get the results that we're looking for. So what are the standards that we can develop, but that also are combined with the scaling science? So I think there's a significant research agenda there. And then I think this question that I raised earlier, which is what is adaptation, what is resilience, and how do we think about making investments that instill that and can create those environments where households and people like the ones that we've heard from already here today can have more of that capacity to manage. Clearly, the challenges are coming, so we've got to make the investments now to be ready for them.
Well, maybe I can ask it a different way then. So how is BRAC as an organization adapting?
Ooh, yeah, tough one. Well, let me say that answer in two ways. In some ways, we're not changing at all. In some ways, we're like everybody else. There's just a massive curveball been thrown at us. So let me talk about the change quickly first. One is livelihoods, adapting livelihoods. So that's a lot of the graduation work, but it goes beyond that within BRAC. The second is risk mitigation. A lot of this is about being, we do some risk financing, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is actually preparing and anticipating the changes that are already underway. And the third is the mass migration. I mean, clearly in Bangladesh, we're going to face that. But that's there in many of the other countries where we also work. So it's preparing. Let me say, though, the last thing that I don't think will change for BRAC, which is our fundamental belief that people lie at the center of the solution, and our job is to try and create the conditions under which they're able to solve their problems.
And do you see potential solutions starting to emerge?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think back on the history of BRAC when I think about the challenges that we face. And so I was taken to Bangladesh as a young kid. And I don't know what the poverty rate is, shortly after independence. So my parents were working there. My mother was actually the sort of 25th employee of BRAC. So I only joined BRAC 2 years ago, but it's been with me my whole life. It was a desperately poor country. There was a famine in 1974. But I see the progress. I go back today. We're approaching middle income status, which is difficult to imagine in Bangladesh. And so development can happen. And so I think BRAC, we've seen it, we've lived it. So we go into a lot of these other places with a great deal of hope, frankly, and optimism. And even hope and optimism has a self-fulfilling prophecy to it. So we try and see that in all the places we work.
Yeah, that's great. And so two things to close. First, I want to thank you. I think, JPAL's work doesn't happen without its partners, and BRAC has been a long-standing partner. And then second, I think, as you've suggested that, one of the most effective things that, you and together with JPAL are identifying ways to alleviate poverty, and to the extent that, as you've nicely described, that can be a really powerful way of helping people become more resilient. There's a lot of hope in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Thank you, everyone.
Happy birthday.